All right, welcome to 27.3 lecture on the circulatory system. So we're going to be talking about the heart today, but more so what it does and what that looks like in different animals. Remember, we're still in kingdom Animalia, so we're talking about, first of all, eukaryotes. We're in the domain eukaryote, and then we're in the animal kingdom. And we'll talk about different phylums, I guess you would say, like vertebrates and invertebrates specifically have very different ways of circulating blood. So let's first talk about why in the world do we need to circulate blood? What's the point of having a circulatory system? Well, let's think about section 1 and section 2. I know this kind of seems like a no-brainer, but let's really think about what's going on here. Section 1, we talked about the digestion system. So how we get nutrients and food within us for our cells, because remember, our cells need glucose or other high energy molecules, and they need to break those high energy molecules down to smaller pieces, slowly extracting the energy and making ATP that's done in the mitochondria or whatever. And so let's just say I ate some fettuccine, which I just did a few minutes ago. Now that fettuccine is in my stomach and is being broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, well, eventually I'm going to have that pasta broken down into glucose monomers. Okay, now what? How do I get that glucose to my cells? And when it gets to my cells, the cells can't break down glucose unless they have oxygen. Remember cellular respiration. And so let's say I've inhaled a good breath of air. I've got now oxygen in my bloodstream. I've got glucose in my bloodstream. But how can I get both those things to my cells so that they can use them? And remember, once the cells go through cellular respiration and they break down glucose in the presence of oxygen, what is the byproduct? CO2 and water. We can keep the water or we can urinate it out later, but that CO2, we got to do something with it pretty quick. And so the respiration system is for that. Your lungs are going to breathe out CO2. But how do the cells get the CO2 back to your lungs so that gas exchange can occur? Because I got CO2 building up in my legs right now from the cells that are there, CO2 in my brain from the neurons in my brain that are digesting sugar, hopefully, because even neurons need ATP, lots of ATP. So how does that CO2 get to the lungs? It's all about the heart. The heart is the circulatory system, I should say. The circulatory system is responsible for allowing us to move nutrients, to move things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, which are needed or not needed, whatever it is. We need to move stuff around in our bodies, and we need to do that quickly, and we need to do that efficiently. And so the circulatory systems will vary accordingly. Let's kind of have a look at some now as we look into our so we're starting here. This is kind of a short section, by the way, too, guys. I did make an extension to this section, so we're going to be looking at the four-chambered heart, the one we have, in a little bit more detail, so watch that video. But in general, we're just looking at two central questions here. Basically, how do open and closed circulatory systems compare? Because you have two types. You have an open circulatory system and you have a closed circulatory system. You might say closed. Why would we want closed? Well, you'll see why that's actually better. How do the patterns of circulation in vertebrates compare? So if you want to really focus on the vertebrates and zoom into just that category of animals, then that phylum of animals, that phylum in the animal kingdom, have a very special way of doing that, and there's a little bit of differences there between the different organisms. So we'll get to that last. All right, first of all, let's look at open and closed circulatory systems. Well, first of all, it's important to note that all circulatory systems are going to have a heart. They have to have some kind of heart-like structure that's going to be a hollow, muscular organ that's going to pump the blood around the body. All right, that can either, again, now be part of an open or closed circulatory system, but you got to have a heart, which is a muscle, a strong muscle that is able to pump blood. And in the open circulatory system, it's basically like this easy. And this would be for like arthropods, like you see here, like an insect. A lot of the insects are arthropods, or mollusks as well. That's another phylum in the animal kingdom. So arthropods and mollusks, they are pretty simple. Mollusks are going to be like clams or shellfish, or technically even an octopus is in the mollusca phylum, but squid, things like that are as well. Arthropods are going to be most of your insects. And so basically the way the open circulatory system works is like this. You have your heart, and then you obviously have your blood vessels, but the vessels eventually are just going to leak out into sinuses and organs. So it's just going to leak out into cavities basically that are directly around the cells. All right. I like the book says this here. Basically the blood is going to empty into either a system of sinuses or spongy cavities, right? So the cavity could kind of be like a sponge, so it absorbs all the blood pretty easily, but then the blood will leave that area too. So, but basically the point right here is, this is the most important sentence here: blood comes into direct contact with body tissues. So it's literally like the organs are being soaked in blood, and that's not how it works in our body, believe it or not. I know when you get cut or whatever, like blood comes out and you feel like you're just full of blood inside you, but that's not the way it works. All our blood is contained within vessels. Your organs are not resting in blood. Blood is being carried to the organs, but blood never leaves vessels. And so before I go into that type of system, let's remember that the open circulatory system is open in the sense that blood does not always stay contained within some vessel. Like for here you have the heart, and so yes, the blood is contained within the heart as it pumps, and then the blood is also contained within these vessels, yes, for some time. But at the end of the line, whenever you finally reach the organs that need the blood or whatever, or that want to drop stuff off or deposit stuff into the blood, where that takes place is just in open area, and there's no containment necessarily. Now you could argue that the organism itself is containing all of the blood by its exoskeleton or whatever, and yes, that's true, but the point is the blood's not always staying within a vessel. Whereas closed circulatory systems like we have, and believe it or not, some invertebrates, like the really active ones, and even some mollusks, and the annelids, which would be like a heartworm. I mean, not a heartworm, an earthworm. There is such a thing as a heartworm, though, and I wonder if there's that type of an annelid or not. I have to look that up. So the annelids and the mollusks and many active invertebrates. So annelids would be an example of a very active invertebrate. Earthworms are very active. They actually keep all of their blood within vessels. It never leaves the vessels. So here's how it works. And this is just like us too, by the way. All vertebrates, actually, all vertebrates. All organisms in the animal kingdom that have a backbone, in that phylum, chordata is actually the actual phylum, is chordata, sometimes nicknamed vertebrates. They're all going to have this system. So again, the way it works is you have a heart-like structure. I should have just said heart. I don't know what other structure you'd have here, but in an earthworm or an annelid, the hearts are so small and there's so many of them that they just call them heart-like structures. It's basically just a muscular pump, but it doesn't really have any chambers or too much specialty to it. But this is going to pump the blood, and the blood is going to stay inside of vessels. Even when it gets to the tissues and the organs, it stays inside of small vessels. We actually call those small vessels capillaries. So capillaries are super small, tiny blood vessels. I wouldn't say microscopic, but almost microscopic. They are so tiny, and the thickness of the vessel is really, really thin. So the thickness is very small, like it's super thin, almost like tissue paper, and that is so that the oxygen can diffuse out of the blood, and so that carbon dioxide can diffuse into the blood, or other things can move as well. All right, you want stuff to move in and out of the bloodstream, right? Because you do want movement. That's why I said in the beginning, you might think closed. What's the point of a closed circulatory system if nothing can come and go? Well, that's a word to argue about. It's not completely closed in the fact that substances can't come and go, but blood itself does not come and go. When you're talking about capillaries, you're still talking about vessels. Blood is not just leaking out of capillaries unless you cut them. And so, but substances can. So that's what's pretty cool, is substances can come and go from blood vessels and transport over into cells, directly into cells. All right, so imagine, I just got a cool analogy here, a visual. Let's say this white square here is a cell. Imagine the cell is just sitting here watching all the delivery drivers drive by, and they're saying, like the mailman, and they're saying, hey, I need to drop this off. So they drop it off into the blood. And then hemoglobin comes around and says, hey, I got some oxygen. You need some oxygen? And the white cell is here is like, yeah, I need some oxygen, so I'll take it. So it picks up the cell. But the post office never comes into the house. He doesn't go into the cell. He just drops his stuff off at the box, right? Same with the person delivering to the postman. They just put it at the street and let it be done. There's no actually going into the post office man's truck, and the post office man doesn't come into your house. So the blood stays inside of vessels, all right? But the substances can leak across it because that's called semi-permeable membrane. As the cell membrane is semi-permeable and capillaries are semi-permeable. Okay. So just the point is that it circulates entirely within blood vessels that extend throughout the body. That being said, let's look at single and double loop circulations. And when we have single and double loop circulations, when we talk about single loop and a double loop circulation system, we're talking about vertebrates. So we're going to forget now about invertebrates and open we're tossing the open circulatory system away. We're not even talking about that's super simple. We're not dealing with that anymore. We're strictly talking about closed circulatory systems. Within closed circulatory systems, which are more advanced, you've got a single and a double, and you can probably guess which one of those is more advanced. It's the double loop. That's the one we have here. The single loop is not as advanced, but let's look at the difference. Most vertebrates with gills, like fish, are going to have a single loop circulatory system. So fish that have gills, or as we learned, other organisms that have gills, they're going to have a single circulatory system in which blood is pumped around the body in one direction. Okay? The whole system is just one giant loop, one single loop. Let's follow it. By the way, here's some terms you need to know, and you'll catch this in my other video. They're also vocab words here. Atriums always receive blood. Always receive blood from somewhere in the body. Ventricles always pump blood out of the heart. Okay? And depending on what kind of heart you're looking at and such, the ventricles can pump to different places. But in the open loop or single loop circulatory system, in the single loop circulatory system, it's the ventricle that is first going to pump blood out to the gills. But again, ventricle just means it's the chamber that pumps blood out. But again, in this case, it's with the single loop, it's going to be capillaries that are going to receive the blood first, and that's going to be deoxygenated. And so we usually use the color blue to represent deoxygenated blood, which means there's no oxygen in it, or little oxygen in it. And then at the gills, remember all the surface area that's available that makes it easy for oxygen to quickly diffuse in. And so at the gills and all the capillaries that are there at the gills, you're going to get a huge gas exchange. In fact, you're not only going to get oxygen being brought in, but CO2 being dropped off at the gills so that the fish can release the CO2. But the oxygen then can just go straight directly to the next body capillaries, whether that be muscles, whether that be organs like the liver, the kidney, or whatever, or even the heart itself. But usually the heart has blood vessels that usually supply itself. We'll talk about that over here. But after that, after the cells, whatever this organ is or whatever body capillary this is, after the oxygen gets used up, Then you have deoxygenated blood again, so it's going to be blue, and we run it back to the atrium, which is going to receive blood, and then we just start the process all over again. We go to the ventricle, and there's actually a pumping. If you watch this heart pump, you'll see that it's not just one giant squeeze or one giant motion. It's actually kind of a rhythmic motion, and at some point, just the atrium squeezes blood into the ventricle, and then the ventricle squeezes so that blood can leave the ventricle. All right, so these are two separate chambers, actually. Atrium is one chamber, and the ventricle is another chamber. But always key to remember is that ventricle is a chamber that pumps blood away from the heart, and atrium is a chamber that receives blood. Okay, so let's look at a double loop circulatory system. The way this one works, and your book just says it's because of evolution, but the way this one works is that as God evolved his creativity, I should say, and decided to make more organisms that are more advanced than others, then what he did was he created a double loop circulatory system, which this one is super efficient. This is so awesome. This allows for a lot of terrestrial or land vertebrates that have a backbone to become much larger and more active. So it's almost limitless when you have a double loop circulatory system and what it can sustain, because the capillary networks can become so much larger. You see, with this one system, this one loop system, you're constantly trying to pump everything by this one little heart. And you could have a large network of capillaries here that the heart couldn't sustain. It's just not enough. The heart's not big enough to sustain all of the movement through all of the capillaries in the networks. So if you have a bigger network of body capillaries, you're going to need this two-chambered heart, which here's the way it works. You basically have one loop called the pulmonary loop and one loop called the systemic loop. And this is where I did a video. If you go and watch that after this, I'm going to upload it later this evening after I upload this one. So hopefully I shouldn't run into difficulties. I use my iPad at school, and hopefully I can get that uploaded right away. But basically I made a map, which is I'm going to want you guys to reproduce on the test. So you're going to need to again, that's going to be a test component. It's going to be obviously open notes, open video, or whatever, but I'll have you either reproduce that or fill in the blank of one I produce. We'll see how I do that. So I don't want you guys just copying what I wrote down. I do want you to copy. I want you to, get practice drawing the map that you see in the video. It's basically a map like this, just with a lot more labels. But I want you to be able to come up with that kind of from scratch without looking. No, again, we're going to have an open book test, and so that temptation's always there, but I want you to be able to understand what you're drawing and labeling. So it's important that you watch that video, because there will be some things you don't see here. But let's talk about the way this works, and maybe I can mention some of those terms though. So again, you have a double loop circulatory system with two circuits. A pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary means lung. Pulmonary means lung. So you have your pulmonary circuit that go to the lungs and back, and you have your systemic circuit, which basically just goes to all of your organ systems, whether that be your excretory system or your respiratory, no, not the respiratory, that'd be up here, your skeletal system, your muscular system, whatever system, any kind of organ or tissue, any organ system that's outside of the lungs needs blood supply. It needs oxygen. It needs a place to drop off its waste. Okay, I just took my trash out to the curb this morning, so it's a great analogy. If I had to, put my trash into the bloodstream, you can think of roads as arteries and veins and capillaries, and so good, arteries and veins. I'm glad I brought those up, because those are words that are in my video and I should bring up now. So let's trace the flow of blood through a double loop circulatory system. So since it's a pulmonary circuit that kind of makes this unique, let's start there. If we have deoxygenated blood, we need to get rid of it and take it to a place where we can get oxygen. We need to get it out of the heart and take it to a place where we can get oxygen. So that's going to be where we start. So arteries are always going to leave the heart, and veins always come back to the heart. So keep that in mind. And if we're leaving the heart right now, this would be an artery. And since we're going to the lungs, this would be a pulmonary artery. So we have a pulmonary artery carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs, where gas exchange is going to occur. And then oxygen-rich blood is going to come back to the heart through a pulmonary vein. And as it enters the heart, it's going to enter the heart via the right atrium. Now, this, you can't see it well here because this is a bad, horribly drawn diagram, but the right atrium is actually over here. It's going to be on the pig's right, or your right. If you're doing a heart surgery on somebody, it's going to be their right. So oh no, excuse me. This is correct. It's going to enter the left atrium. So this is the left atrium over here. So it does look backwards, so that means it's right. This is the person's left atrium. And then it's going to go to the left ventricle, where it gets pumped out through what we just call basically a systemic artery, which the specific name is aorta. There's actually two of them, one that goes up into your brain and one that goes down to the rest of your body. So you have an ascending and descending aorta. But I just call it a systemic artery, which is going to branch and branch and branch and branch and branch and branch into multiple arteries until eventually you get capillaries. And that's at the capillaries where you start to get a little bit of mixing, because you start to lose oxygen and you start to gain carbon dioxide. So that's why I kind of see a color change here. And then whatever organs are receiving oxygen and dropping off their waste, they're going to have these capillaries. And then deoxygenated blood, or oxygen poor blood, is brought back to the heart via a vein. Remember, so I just call this a systemic vein because it's coming from body systems, organ systems. It's coming from organ systems, so it's a systemic vein, but it's actually called a vena cava. And again, you have a superior and an anterior vena cava. One comes from the bottom and one comes from the top. But they meet and they enter the heart via the right atrium. And so once they enter the right atrium, then that gets pumped to the right ventricle, at which the right ventricle can pump it out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs for gas exchange to occur. And then we just keep this process going over and over and over. So you see, blood first has to go to the lungs just to do gas exchange, come back, and then it's ready for the rest of the body. Now you might say that actually looks like it's less efficient, doesn't it? I just saw that as I said that and kind of traced this. It seemed in my mind that, wow, that's actually like less efficient to have to go to the lungs first to get your oxygen. It's like having to go to the bank first before you go to the grocery store. It's kind of nice when the money's already in your bank account, but if you have to go to the bank and drop off your deposits or deposit money and then withdraw the money and then go to the store to make your purchase, wouldn't that be less efficient? But it's actually not, because this allows you to drop off thousands of dollars and collect thousands of dollars at one time. Then you can go to the body and do all kinds of shopping. Whereas here, you can only pick up like $10 at a time. And so you're constantly having to go through this loop over and over and over, like so many times. Whereas here, you don't need to travel as fast. And with this one, you can actually build up a lot more pressure. A lot more pressure. That's a key word there. Actually, that may even be more key than the other concept. So if you read this, using a single pump to force blood through the entire system would have been increasingly difficult. This tissue was avoided as the lineage of vertebrates that led to reptiles, birds, and mammals evolved. So basically, again, the idea for evolutionists is that this heart eventually evolved into this heart, which then led to the demand of this pulmonary circuit. But that seems kind of a stretch to me, to be honest with you, that arteries and veins would just decide to become a whole new circuit. That's kind of odd, but that's obviously a design, I would say, intentional design. So if you look at the mammalian heart chamber evolution, I mean, there's definitely a progression in how advanced the system is. So we can look at that if we want, and we'll just replace those words with evolution. But either way, you can see kind of the progression of going from a simple heart all the way up to a 4-chambered heart. And believe it or not, there's actually a 3-chambered heart. So amphibians, those organisms that live on land and water usually, I know that word has more to do with where they're born, whether it's land or water, but amphibians that typically do both, they'll usually have 3-chambered hearts. And even a reptile as well, like a crocodile or a lizard, snake, reptiles and amphibians will usually have like a 3-chambered heart, which is kind of in between. Now, I know this book didn't really go into this it does go into it in text, but it doesn't with an image, so I thought it'd be best just to look at an image here. How about that? So let's, open image in a new tab. Yeah, how about this? Oh, but am I going to be able to zoom in? Let's see. Yeesh. You can zoom in, but that's super blurry, huh? But I think you get the point here. So with a 2-chambered heart, you just have a ventricle and an atrium. With a 4-chambered heart, you have 2 atriums at the top and 2 ventricles at the bottom. So we've talked about both of those. It's this 3-chambered heart in the middle that refers to reptiles and amphibians. And you basically are still going to have 2 atriums. You're still going to have 2 places where blood comes into the heart. Atria is the single atrium is atrium is singular, atria is plural. So atria, they're using 2 lines to refer to the atria, but this is an atrium and this is an atrium. You have 2 of those still, but you only have 1 ventricle, and it's in this ventricle where you get sort of a mixing of blood. You get sort of a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So the blood that you see here in blue and you see here in red is not quite all red and all blue. You should see kind of a mix there. In fact, let's do this. Let's Google 3-chamber heart. 3-chambered heart. Isn't that crazy how you can totally misspell stuff and it'll know exactly what you're talking about? You can see how there is almost a septum here. A septum is what divides the left and right ventricles. You have sort of a septum here, but it doesn't quite go all the way to the top. So you have sort of a mixing there. Here's a good one. I like this image. This is an amphibian heart. So you have an atria, you have your right atrium, your left atrium, but in this ventricle here, you get a purple. You get blue and red, which make purple, right? And so what else? Here's a pretty good image too. Here's a pretty good image. You have your capillaries and you have your other capillaries, but notice this is the systemic circulation, and this would be the pulmonary circulation. And so you have blood coming into an atrium and then going into the ventricle where you sort of get a mixing. So the blood that goes to the systems, the blood that goes to the organs, I like this picture, this is way better. It should be purple, right? The blood that's here should be purple because it was already mixed with deoxygenated blood. But then it's going to be blue, like hardcore blue. Like there's no oxygen in this blood. It comes back into an atrium and then gets mixed here. It gets mixed in the ventricle, and so you actually pump sort of partially oxygenated blood to the capillaries or the gills or lungs or whatever. You actually get sort of oxygenated blood, but then it really gets oxygenated once it gets to the gills or lungs. And then it comes back to the heart, fully oxygenated into the left atrium, at which it then will be pumped literally from the atrium to the ventricle, just a short little pump. And so again, each one of these chambers acts as kind of their own little pump, and so when the heart beats, you know what, let's do this. Let's see if I can find a GIF of a beating heart. Maybe not. I don't know. Can you look up GIFs like in the image like this? Oh, yes, cool. This is perfectly. I was trying to explain this in the video too. But do you see how you see how this pumps before that pumps? It's not just one giant squeezing motion. It's like this gets squeezed before, this gets squeezed before that gets squeezed, and then after this gets squeezed, it's very there's a rhythm to this. Right? And that's because literally each one of these ventricles and each one of these atriums on the left and right are acting as their own chambers. So this is not just one pump squeezing blood in one direction. You got blood coming in, you got blood going out, and you got two totally separate circuits in this four-chambered heart. That's really cool. I like that GIF. Let's see if I can add that to the Google Classroom or something. Anyways, all right. Well, that's actually all I was going to have for you guys. If you did want to look at any of these questions together, can you describe an open circulatory system and describe a closed circulatory system? Absolutely. Look at the key answers there. There's a major difference, and you can answer literally in one sentence. You don't even have to make those two sentences. What about which groups of animals tend to have each type of circulatory system? So if you go back and you listen or read the text, you'll see that there's certain groups of animals. Remember, animals is kingdoms. And so with phylums, you have invertebrates, you have vertebrates, and then even in that phylum, you have different domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you have different classes and families. Like I think we talked about the annelids. And so you look to see which ones tend to have a type of each type of circulatory system. And then let's see, I think if you remember, the vertebrates kind of always stick to one thing. We're pretty complex, so we definitely have a closed and we definitely have a double loop, right? Actually, we could have a single, some vertebrates could have a single loop, like an alligator, for example. It has a double loop. Excuse me, sorry. But it has a three-chambered heart. But mammals definitely have a four-chambered heart, so we have a double loop. And if you're double loop, that obviously means you have a closed circulatory system. But you can go back and read the text and see which animals tend to have each type of circulatory system where there's a little bit of diversity. And then how does having a closed circulatory system benefit a large active animal? Well, it has to do with that second circuit, that second pulmonary circuit that allows you to pick up large amounts of oxygen or do a large amount of gas exchange. Makes it very efficient to pump through larger networks of capillaries. And then what are two different patterns of circulation found in vertebrates? I think I just said that. Like an alligator is technically a vertebrate because it has a backbone, but it's not a mammal. But it's a vertebrate, but it doesn't have it doesn't have a four-chambered heart, does it? It has a three-chambered heart. And then, so it says, what are two different patterns of circulation found in vertebrates? So you could say a three-chambered heart and a four-chambered heart. To B, what is the major structural difference between vertebrates that have a single loop circulatory system and those that have a double loop circulatory system? So what's the major structural difference between vertebrates? All right, it's going to have to do with it's going to have a lot to do with the structure of the heart itself. It's going to actually need four chambers instead of three. If you're going to have a double loop circulatory system, then you're going to need a four-chambered heart. You're also going to need you're going to need very specific blood vessels that do those jobs. All right, I'm trying to think of a better way to answer that question. What is the major structural difference between vertebrates that have a single loop circulatory system and those that have a double loop circulatory system? I know one major one too. The single loop circulatory system, remember, if you look at figures 27.11, it points this out. We said that if you're just using the single loop situation, you're typically going to have gills, like fish have gills, right? Fish are still vertebrates. They still have a backbone, but they use gills. If you're going to have lungs, then that's what's going to give you a double loop circulatory system, right? Lungs are pretty advanced. They are allowed to pick up a lot of oxygen and get rid of a lot of carbon dioxide. So the point is, since they can do so much gas exchange, lungs are always going to basically mean that you're going to need a 4-chambered heart to power that. It's almost like buying equipment for your car that you couldn't even handle it, right? So if you're going to have high-performance parts on your car, you need a car that can handle those parts. Well, if you want lungs, you're going to need a 4-chambered or a double loop. You're going to need a double loop circulatory system. But gills are pretty much only going to be able to power a single loop circulatory system, right? But again, fish and a mammal like us are still going to both be vertebrates. So there's how you would finally get a good structural difference. I think the last way I answered that was the best. Don't worry about number 3. I don't think I have you guys do number 3. Yeah, I do. Do you think large active vertebrates would have been likely to succeed if closed circulatory systems had not evolved? Well, the obvious answer is no. We could just replace the word evolved with created. The obvious answer is no. If you had to explain your reasoning, it would be because the demand for oxygen would be way too high for what the open circulatory system would have allowed, right? We're not talking about single or double loop here. We're talking about open or closed. And if you don't even have a closed circulatory system, then you're definitely not going to get that active, because you need vessels that can build up pressure and that can pump blood quickly. All right, you can't do that very quickly in an open circulatory system where stuff just leaks into cavities and then is brought back. All right. Okay, again, thanks for watching. That's going to be it. Bye-bye.